So I know you share this on Facebook. I know you're on the editorial board of Mass Benchmarks.
Correct.
This is a publication put out by the Donahue Institute at UMass in cooperation with the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. Um,
Yep. Sounds fancy.
yeah, lots of names there. And recently there was a statement or like a commentary on the state of the state economy that was released, which said, among other things, that uh, to quote, small businesses that rely on steady cash flow are likely to go out of business, and temporarily shuttered businesses are likely to shed workers. A global recession is a virtual certainty, and the impact on the state economy will be direct, um, both from the essential shutdown of public gatherings and reduced commerce, and indirect from the significant slowdown of national and global economies. How do you see this either playing out or manifesting on the local level here in the city, and on sort of broader levels?
I mean, locally, I fear for small, independent, mom and pop, as they're referred to sometimes, businesses, locally owned small restaurants, diners, places like that, that don't out that live right to the sort of cash flow edge, and don't have structures to be able to, for the next little while, do takeout, do meals to go, and those sorts of things that at least can take some pressure off by having a certain amount of money coming in. And so I think that I fear for those sorts of places in Lowell, and they've really been the lifeblood, in a way, of the revitalization of the city. The immigrant-owned, refugee-owned small businesses, barbershops, hair salons, nail places, small restaurants, small coffee shops that dot around the city. Small Cambodian, Vietnamese restaurants, Indian restaurants in Middlesex Village, all those places. And if they don't come back, it really leaves the city bereft of one of the things that I think makes it such an interesting place to live and work. So I see that as a really serious problem. I think also locally, I think that higher ed is going to really change. I don't see how all of the colleges and universities in Massachusetts survive this. And I think, at least initially, lots of the small privates, not so much like a UMass Lowell, but small private colleges that have been in trouble anyway, are not going to be able to weather this, because I think that we are in for a period of lower enrollments. We are in for a period of even the thriving colleges and universities in Greater Boston that rely on large numbers of international students are not going to have those students next year. They're just simply not coming. I don't care what anybody says, they're not going to risk coming here and being caught here again after everything that people have gone through for the last 2 or 3 months. And so all of that revenue stream is going to pass away as well. And I think all of that's going to really reshape. And I don't think that's going to happen overnight, but I think in the next 3 to 5 years, what a lot of people were thinking would happen anyway, which I hate to think will happen, a lot more delivery of education is going to shift from colleges and universities to online, or at least some kind of a hybrid, half and half, whatever it would be. I think that's a shame, particularly for what I teach. I mean, I think teaching history requires me being able to look at the people in front of me and talk to them, and have them talk to me, and sort of be aware of whether what I'm saying is making sense or not, and whatever. And I can't do that on a computer screen. So I think those things are really difficult. I actually think the Massachusetts economy in certain areas is probably going to actually rebound really quickly. And I think that's the obvious: biotech, medicine, in those fields. Once the initial sort of first rush of treating patients is taken care of, and collectively hospitals can figure out what's the best way to be doing this, and over the summer they can begin to secure the necessary supplies they'll need if this reoccurs in the fall, that will get better. Nobody was just ready for the pace with which this happened. But I think biotech companies, I think companies working on virus research, vaccine research, crunching the numbers to try to understand how this spread, and how you do create walls and barriers to preventing it. I think all of those places are going to rebound and do really well in Massachusetts. So that's good news for people in those fields that have the education skill sets and the training skill sets to be able to inhabit those positions. But a lot of workers who are working, in fast foods, in the back of the house in hotels, working, cleaning and making up rooms and working in the kitchens and things like that. I think it's going to be a while before the thousands of those folks in Massachusetts are going to get their positions back. And so I really don't know. I don't think the stimulus package that was put in place, nor anything that's been done yet at the state level, is even coming close to dealing with the possibilities of what that's going to mean in 2 or 3 months, when whatever savings people might have had are gone, and the added benefit to unemployment is going to run out. I mean, there's additions to what people are collecting that they'll be able to collect, I believe it is, for 4 months. But that only gets us through like April, May, June into early July. And then what happens? The state relies a lot in the summer on tourism, on people going to the Cape, and lots of college students have jobs on the Cape. Those jobs are not going to be there. So I do think, I mean, when the benchmarks board was mulling over like what to say, some people were saying, well, we shouldn't make it too pessimistic, and others were saying, well, how can we not? It is what it is, and we can't put a dress on it or lipstick on it or work overalls on it and say it'll all be okay. It's gonna be really, really hard. I don't see, that might not sound good to people listening, but I'm a realist. Most people would say I'm a pessimist, but in this case, I don't think my pessimism outruns the reality.
No, I know I've had a lot of my friends have lost their jobs lately working in service of bartending or waitressing and
Sure.
all these things. You mentioned the same has happened to your children, and the federal stimulus package really seems to fail to do the bare minimum for worker support or worker relief during this. I guess as sort of a two-part question, do you think there's an historical precedent that people should be looking to for sort of an economic contraction of this size, and a response to help workers? And do you think there's an organizing response that workers themselves could be looking at taking?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, the closest approximation, well, there's a few, right? I mean, you can go back quite a bit further in history to the flu pandemic, right up toward the end of World War I, 1917, 1918. Completely different world at that time. And, millions of people lost their lives in that. And I think there were way more deaths associated with that flu pandemic than anything I think that we're going to see in this one. But we were coming toward the end of the First World War. People were coming back from Europe. Troops were coming back from Europe sick. And Fort Devens, which is right near where we're talking now in Lowell, not too far away out Route 2, lots of troops came back on ships and were immediately put on closed trains and driven to Fort Devens and socially distanced. They didn't call it that then, but that's what happened. And they stayed there until they were symptom-free before they were let loose on society. But by that point, as that starts winding down, there's all this work to be done, rebuilding war-torn economies, getting the American economy back moving again, making consumer products for all this pent-up demand from the years of sacrifice during the First World War. And so there was a stimulus there that could work. In the 1930s, the same way. Stock market crashes, banks close, people are struggling, nobody has savings. And if anybody even had a small amount of money, people like my grandfather at the time, they lost it when the banks failed. But the stimulus that ultimately the federal government put forth, even though most historians would agree it was never enough, it stabilized the slide. And because people could get the money from these public works projects, or my dad in the Civilian Conservation Corps planting trees out in North Adams and whatnot, they got money and they could spend it. Right now, if you get this $1,200 check whenever people are going to get it, you're going to pay some bills with it, but it's not going to re-stimulate the larger economy, the local restaurants and shops we were talking about. You're not going to take the $1,200 and on 5 or 6 successive nights go downtown in Lowell and, you know, go to Fuse or, you know, Tremonte or Life Alive or Sizzling Kitchen, you know, or Viet Thai or wherever and eat. You're going to pay your electric bill, your cable bill if you're fortunate enough to keep it, and your rent, right, or your mortgage or your car payment or whatever. So that's not going to regrow jobs, and so that's the real dilemma. And I'm not sure, sitting here now, what it's possible to do about that. That's just that reality. But I do think coming out of this, if there's a window of 6 to 8 to 10 months, that's a window when people can get put back to work, making ventilators, making masks, making gloves. You can re-stimulate a manufacturing economy and get people back to work for some stretch of time, engaging in that kind of activity. And again, then hopefully whatever might happen in the fall won't be as bad and will respond more quickly. The same holds true for organizing, because again, in the 30s, when workers were upset with the way they were being treated by General Motors or Ford, they occupied the factory. They, you know, several hundred people sat in a factory for a couple months. We can't do that now. And so you can create a virtual general strike, I guess, which I think some grocery delivery services and some Amazon warehouses and things like that, people are doing that. They're socially organizing online to not go to work, but it's different. But the strength of that activity is everybody being in a bunch, screaming and hollering and singing and chanting and hugging each other and engaging in that kind of thoughtful enterprise, right, of solidarity. And it's hard to, like, I'm looking at you now and you're looking at me, but it's hard to be, and I see that as solidarity on some level, right, that we're talking to each other, but it's not the same. And so I really don't know. There's nothing else, you know, as a labor historian, there isn't anything I can compare this to. The moments when workers made their greatest gains is when they physically came together and either occupied something or knocked something down or broke a bunch of machines or occupied, you know, a factory building or put heavy duty political pressure on Congress or whatever it might be. We can still engage in a little bit of that, but it's not the same as there being a crowd of people being angry. And I don't know. I mean, I'm not that astute with social media, but I'm not feeling like it can do that in the same way. And so I'm struggling to try to understand, like, how do we build that kind of a movement? I think out the other side is where the opportunity will come, because I think if people are really honest and thinking about how this happened, the fact that we don't have higher wages for people and that we've allowed things to grow to the point of this vast inequality that we have, that we have too many millions of people without adequate health insurance. I think those questions will be called when this winds down. Now, that winding down may be a year or two away, you know, in all reality. It may well be that this coming election doesn't do anything great in terms of fixing these bigger structural problems, but I think particularly for people under 40, let's say, to really think about how the hell did this happen, and then to really think thoughtfully about, okay, well, what do we want out of our social, political, economic systems, our educational systems? How did this happen? And what can be done? I think that's where the change will come. Unfortunately, being old, I may not see it. I hope I do. I hope I'm around to help. But one never knows. That's why I don't go shop for groceries. But I think that's when the change is going to come. I do think it will happen after. I don't think substantial change is going to happen during. And I'm sorry if that seems pessimistic, but maybe that's just because of where we're at this particular moment at the end of March in 2020.
And just lastly, to zoom out a bit, and this is sort of broad and theoretical, but I've been reading a lot that is suggesting that we may be at sort of an inflection point in how we organize the global economy, similar to how in the 70s and 80s economy started moving towards, finance-led growth and greater financialization. But now, because we're in a period where smaller and mid-sized firms are going to find it harder to weather this storm, and the larger firms that may do so primarily because of government investment. The most recent stimulus package included $500 billion for private firms to take from. The thought is that we may be moving into an economy that's much more based on these very, very large companies controlling increasing shares of the economy, which would make state investment and public investment an increasingly important sort of terrain for people to organize.
For organizing.
Yeah. Do you think firstly that this sounds sort of like a plausible analysis of what's going on? And if so, what would you say that sort of state and local government and actors should be doing in response to something like that?
Well, I mean, this is interesting because in the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt was suggesting that we should go in that same direction that you just described. We should go to bigness, but bigness should be more publicly controlled. And he ordered that if big companies were going to get the equivalent now we're talking about of stimulus dollars, they had to recognize workers' organizing rights and trade unions. And some of that was the impetus for breaking the logjam at places like Ford, General Motors, U.S. Steel, places like that. It was pressure put on from the worker side, but also from the government side. That if you want to be big in the marketplace and if you want to consolidate and if you want to sort of, gobble up your competitors and create these much bigger holding companies and what have you, then there have to be controls on wages, hours, and conditions of employment. And eventually that translates to worker unrest and the National Labor Relations Act. And so you could envision something, again, it's probably a few years away, but you could begin to make the argument that, well, if we've bailed out Ford, General Motors, the banks, and what have you, then we, the people, have the authority and the responsibility to say nobody can make more than X. The lowest paid worker can't make any less percentage-wise than the highest paid workers, that you'll shrink the gaps between the high paid and the low paid, that you'll begin to attack wage inequality by systematically raising the wages at the bottom and cutting the wages at the top. People at the top have enough already. And you'll start making those kinds of arguments. You'll make arguments around healthcare for everybody, period. You'll probably, it's been talked about during this election cycle, but not probably as much as it will be further on. You'll be talking about minimum guaranteed incomes, that every family based on size should have no lower than this amount of income per month. And so if you're working in a job that's not highly paid, but an important job, and let's say you're making $3,000 a month, and it's determined that a family of four needs $10,000, then the state gives them $7,000. And they're not giving it to them because they're not working, they give it to them because they're working in a meaningful job that isn't being paid the way it ought to be paid. You can imagine that for teachers, nurses, across the board, grocery store workers, and things like that. And so you could see something like that happening. And you can look at these responses, right? Because people that own big grocery stores have, with some push from unions and workers, raised people's wages, right? In the last few weeks, they've decided they can pay people $2, $3, $4 more dollars an hour and things like that. They've also incorporated and given people sick pay and things like that, which they claimed like 6 months ago they couldn't afford to do. but now they are.
Yeah.
3 months ago, 6 months ago, the argument was, well, we can't afford to bolster the healthcare system and provide healthcare for all. But we came up with 2 point something trillion dollars magically overnight. Healthcare for everybody wouldn't cost that much money, no matter what price tag we put on it. So I think, again, historians, people thinking, activists and what have you, will take the lessons from what happened here and begin to craft a much different plan. I think ultimately the two-party system has to go away. I think that even though this election cycle is going to be weird because of everything that's happening, the Democratic Party failed, in my opinion, over the last election cycle since Trump won, to articulate a reasonable, rational alternative, and basically just dabbled at the margins. I think Bernie Sanders was pushing the hardest to move the conversation to the left, and a lot of the things he argued for are things that actually are covertly happening. They're just not saying Bernie said it. But I think, again, in the aftermath of all this, whether it's 2 years, 3 years, whatever, the political process is going to realign. I think we are at your word, an inflection point. The same way, again, we were in the 30s. I mean, big business ran America in the 20s. And in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, the scale tipped toward the working class. Unionization rates went up to 35, 40, 45%, over half in some key industries. And then in the 60s, Democrats and Republicans started saying, oh, wait a minute, those working class people have too much power, and started stripping it away. And we've now spent 50 years, we spent 40 or so years of sort of the rise of some level of working class political social power, some basic leveling of social benefits, retirement, sick pay, health insurance, things that workers were able to get in their union contracts. And that now we've spent 45 or 50 years having that stripped away. And it's probably sadly going to take 2 or 3 decades to rebuild it, because we're not going to come out of this easy.